Disclaimer, not all of the subjects in this video are equally repugnant. Some may even mean well, but just be misguided. Nonetheless, they all, in their own way, serve as illustrative examples of liberal/left Zionism. This video is simply an overarching critique of an ideology that should be rejected, not compromised with. When you hear Christian nationalists talk about America, they often say things like, we need to protect our way of life, or we can't let them outnumber us, or we need to stay separate. In the context of a country like the US, we would rightfully clock that rhetoric as right-wing, reactionary. But when we swap Christian for Jewish and America for Israel, suddenly that same rhetoric is called liberal Zionism. As historian Ilan Pappé put it,
the claim that the only way you can create a democracy in a country which has settlers and natives is if the settlers are always the majority, which is the argument of the liberal Zionists, not the right-wing Zionists. The liberal Zionists, the whole peace process is based on the idea that the only way democracy can be sustained in Palestine is if the Jews are a majority in their own homeland.
The obsession with maintaining an ethno-religious majority, the fear that demographic change means retribution, the belief that safety comes from walls and segregation. How is it that in any other country, those beliefs would get you rightfully labeled a right-wing fanatic, but in Israel, those are the talking points coming from the quote-unquote left? If you don't believe me, we could play a little game real quick. I'll show you a quote, and you have to guess if it came from a left-wing Zionist or a white supremacist. Who do you think said, "My country has the right to control the minority population's natural growth. Control of birth rates is not racism"? Was it a liberal Zionist, or was it a Klansman? Nope, I know it sounds pretty Hitlerian, but that was actually Ruth Gavison, an Israeli legal scholar and professor at Hebrew University. Like many left or liberal Zionists, she believed in the idea of a Jewish and democratic state, as if a true democracy could be reconciled with the obsessive need for a Jewish majority and the accompanying legal apparatus designed to maintain that majority. Take the 1950 Law of Return, which states that any Jew born anywhere in the world can instantly become a member of the State of Israel. Now, contrast that with the refusal to allow Palestinians to exercise their right to return to homes and property that was stolen from them. A right affirmed by the UN, by the way, but we'll touch more on that later. Back to the game, who do you think said, "If this state is not the state of my group, and there is not within it a majority of my group, the state does not interest me"? White supremacist or left-wing Zionist? Yeah, you guessed it. That was Yossi Beilin, former chair of the Meretz Party, a social democratic and secular party in Israel that merged into today's Israeli Democrat Party. One more. Who said, "Their natural increase has always been larger than ours. 10 years from now, 50 years from now, they'll be the majority and they'll make the decisions. And if I've got to be a minority, I'd rather not live in this region"? Was that a white No, it's a left-wing it's a Zionist, left-wing Zionist and author Sami Michael. So at this point, you might be confused as to why the so-called leftist, liberal, and progressive Zionists sound identical to your average alt-right 4chan user, and that's because there's no such thing as left-wing Zionism. It's an oxymoron. I'd go as far as to say that even liberal Zionism is a contradictory term. Plenty of people in the West, especially in North America, use the terms liberal and leftist interchangeably. Although there is some overlap, they're not the same. Liberalism claims to uphold individual rights, pluralism, separation of church and state, free markets, Enlightenment principles, and so on. Ironically, many of these are values that Zionism violates in practice. Leftism, on the other hand, while definitely sharing in some of the values I just mentioned, is even more fundamentally incompatible with Zionism. It's about collective liberation, anti-colonialism, economic and political equality, justice, and solidarity across racial and national lines in the pursuit of eliminating arbitrary class distinctions. By that definition, Zionism, an exclusivist settler colonial project built on dispossession, ethnic cleansing, and supremacy, and maintained through a set of policies designed to uphold a demographic majority and subjugate the minority population, is fundamentally at odds with the left. And honestly, it takes quite a bit of slippery argumentation to force its compatibility with liberalism. So how do left or liberal Zionists make their case? Well, typically they oppose the most extreme and violent aspects of the project, things like the obviously illegal and indefensible occupation of the West Bank. They might call Israel's actions in the occupied territories apartheid, and some will rebuke the sheer brutality we see in Gaza today when it goes a little too far for their liking. But ultimately, many of these left liberal Zionists do so more to preserve Israel's image on the world stage than out of any genuine commitment to Palestinian liberation. They rarely address the systemic discrimination within Israel proper, and they continue to defend the state's founding as just and necessary. rather than a supremacist project built on ethnic cleansing and maintained through brutal domination. So for the sake of this video, when I talk about so-called left-wing Zionists, I'm including labor Zionists, liberal Zionists, and everyone else trying to slap a progressive face on a fundamentally reactionary ideology. Any self-proclaimed left-winger, liberal, progressive, or humanist who wants to take a stance on Zionism ought to be an anti-Zionist, full stop, and, in my opinion, should support what Avi Shlaim recommends: one democratic state with equal rights for all its citizens, regardless of ethnicity or religion. We tend to like that idea when it comes to literally any other country. Israel should not get a pass. I mean, what else do you call a state whose laws are literally designed to maintain the majority of a certain ethno-religious group, if not an ethnostate? Whether they're advocating for a more humane occupation or a supposedly peaceful solution that ultimately prioritizes the preservation of Jewish demographic dominance, liberal and left Zionists alike serve the same function: to intellectualize and legitimize an ethno-religious supremacist project instead of aiming to dismantle it. They both sanitize and defend a fascist state. They serve as the intelligentsia for it and fancy themselves as reasonable alternatives to extreme right-wing Zionists like Netanyahu or Ben-Gvir.
A man called Netanyahu who's totally corrupt and incompetent.
But no matter what qualifier you put in front of the word Zionist, with the sole exception being anti, it doesn't change the fact that Zionism is an ideology built on the removal of the native Palestinian population and the replacement by settlers. Apartheid and occupation are not aberrations. They're the logical outcomes of a project that requires constant maintenance through domination. At its core, it's fundamentally genocidal, and liberal/left Zionists should not be credited as proponents of peace for trying to compromise with it. Let's take a quick look at the US Senator and self-proclaimed Democratic Socialist, Bernie Sanders. Don't get me wrong, he's a bit better than most Western politicians when it comes to Palestine, but he still falls strategically short of delivering a substantive critique of Zionism or the Israeli state. What do I mean by that? Bernie will give passionate speeches condemning Benjamin Netanyahu and highlighting the suffering of the Palestinian people. He'll even argue that the US should stop arming Netanyahu's government.
I think the United States should simply say tomorrow to Netanyahu, you're not getting another nickel.
But at the same time, he refuses to call what's happening in Palestine a genocide.
In your view, is what Israel is doing in Gaza a genocide?
In my view, it is absolutely disgraceful, horrible, and I'm doing, as a United States Senator, everything I can to end it.
But do you buy the South African case at the International Court of Justice that what Israel is doing in Gaza constitutes genocide or genocidal acts?
I think, look, we can argue about definitions. It is horrible.
Despite the fact that major human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have no problem using that term. And Bernie even advised against a ceasefire at one point.
Do you support a ceasefire? And if not, why not?
Well, I don't know how you can have a ceasefire, permanent ceasefire, with an organization like Hamas, which is dedicated to turmoil and chaos and destroying the state of Israel.
He avoids naming Israel or Zionism as the root cause, choosing instead to blame only Netanyahu or the far right in Israel, as if the problem started there. Spoiler, it didn't. Plenty of liberal or left Zionists like to proclaim their disapproval of Netanyahu or the Likud party and act as though their advocacy can start and stop there.
Ethan actually voted against Bibi when he lived there, so it kind of did more than you.
This conveniently erases the fact that so-called liberal or left-wing Israeli leaders are also responsible for atrocities. From Ehud Barak's labor government killing unarmed Palestinian civilians in October of 2000, to his racist remarks about Israel being a villa in the jungle, to Yitzhak Rabin's infamous orders to break the bones of non-violent Palestinian protesters during the First Intifada, Netanyahu is not a deviation from Zionism. He is a logical outgrowth of it. Now, Bernie is a guy who's had a long career and has done a lot of good. He's made some serious mistakes as well, but I don't believe him to be malicious, and he's also nowhere near as problematic as the other figures in this video, some of which are genuinely unhinged. That said, his commendable history should not insulate him from criticism when he deserves it. The fact is, Bernie Sanders is unfortunately not an anti-Zionist, and he shares many of the shortcomings that come with liberal and left Zionism. As I mentioned earlier, liberal Zionists tend to hold on to the belief that Israel can be both a democracy and a Jewish state with an emphasis on maintaining a Jewish demographic majority, not able to understand that they hold an irreconcilable position. As I was about to upload this video, the perfect example of what I'm talking about happened to me. One of the subjects of this video responded to a tweet I made where I reiterated the fact that no state has the inalienable right to exist and that Israel is undeniably an ethnostate because it legislates ethno-supremacy. The liberal Zionist in question replied by first admitting that he doesn't deny that Israel is an ethnostate, then spiraled into a rant about how I'm apparently a Mossad agent or something. But the only relevant part of his response is that first part. He acknowledges that Israel is an ethnostate, or at the very least, he doesn't deny it. And yet, somehow, he doesn't seem to realize that this admission raises serious questions about why he still refuses to unequivocally condemn Israel in its entirety. It's an ethnostate, isn't it? Instead, he defends it, and he even defends the act of defending it.
You could defend Israel as a entity.
This is a perfect illustration of the contradiction liberal Zionists grapple with, trying desperately to reconcile Israel's identity as a Jewish ethnostate with its claim to being a democracy. The notion of an exclusive Jewish state is essentially incongruous with liberal democracy, in which equal citizenship rights are granted on a territorial basis to all citizens regardless of their ethnic or national origin. But in Israel, according to its self-identification and vision, it is not a state for all its citizens. Rather, it's a state for the Jewish people throughout the world. This prioritizes Jews over the million-plus indigenous Palestinians who by 2009 comprised around 20% of the state's population. Actual population, not just the ideological population. Israeli law does not recognize an Israeli nationality. Thus, while Jewish citizens are classified as having Jewish nationality, Israeli law methodically strips Palestinian citizens of their national identity and reduces them to mere ethnicity or religious affiliation. As a result, Israel is not just another nation-state in which minority communities lack some secondary rights owned by the majority. Instead, it's a settler colonial state established by the Zionist movement for advancing and expanding its colonialist project for the benefit of Jews alone. Activist and ex-Zionist Tikva Honig-Parnas wrote in her 2011 book, False Prophets of Peace, in which she takes aim at liberal and left Zionists alike and points out how by accepting the premise of Zionism and trying to make nice with it, they inadvertently legitimize and lend credence to far-right figures like Netanyahu and his coalition, who are merely a logical outcome of the ideology. She also goes on to show us how the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the colonial conquest carried out by the original Zionist settlers was done by purported left-wingers. Socialists are what they called themselves, but we'll get back to that in a bit. Honig-Parnas does not shy away from pointing out to liberals how incompatible the prospect of an exclusivist Jewish state is with liberal values. This overlapping of nation and religion runs in direct conflict with the separation of state and religion, she says. But back to Senator Sanders for now. As well-intentioned as he may be, his ideology of left Zionism often shows up as criticism of the post-1967 occupation, while still overall justifying the establishment of the State of Israel. Like many other left Zionists, he'll argue that the conditions in the occupied West Bank are unacceptable and that the settler movement has gone too far. Yet, at the same time, he fails to appropriately factor in the blatantly violent and murderous foundations of the Israeli state that led to the horrors that we see today. Just to remind you, Israel's origins involved ethnic cleansing, mass murder, and war crimes. The ideology driving this, Zionism, was described by its main founder as something colonial. A particularly funny example of this intellectual dissonance is Dalia Golem, the daughter of the founder of the Haganah, the pre-state Zionist paramilitary organization that ethnically cleansed Palestinians before the establishment of the State of Israel, and later became the IDF. Dalia, who fancies herself on the Israeli left, had this to say about the shameful post-67 occupation. My father erected the Haganah and not the occupation. The Haganah, which later became the Israeli Defense Forces, was designed to defend the land, but later became the Israeli occupation force. If my father were alive, he would be shocked to see what I see here and now. Brother, your father was an invader and a terrorist. How can you not see that his actions laid the groundwork for the occupation and are inseparable from the suffering inflicted on Palestinians today? This moral separation of the Nakba from the occupation, the desperation to make the original ethnic cleansing seem just, displays, in my opinion, either naivete or dishonesty. Some liberal Zionist figures like historian Benny Morris even go so far as to call the Nakba, the forced expulsion of Palestinians in 1948, a necessity, and have argued that Israel might actually have peace today if only all the Palestinians had been expelled in 1948. Jesus Christ, dude. Benny is still around and kicking today, by the way. He's even graduated to teaming up with alleged sex pests to own his interlocutors in the marketplace of ideas. so that's cool. There are circumstances in history that justify ethnic cleansing, Morris said. A Jewish state would not have come into being without the uprooting of 700,000 Palestinians. Therefore, it was necessary to uproot them. There was no choice but to expel the population. It was necessary to cleanse the hinterland and cleanse the border areas and cleanse the main roads and the villages from which our convoys and settlements were fired on. And if that is not bad enough, his hatred is not only saved for Palestinians living in the occupied territories, but also the ones living inside the Green Line. Like I said, some liberal left Zionists love to pretend that the Palestinians within Israel proper are fully integrated into society at every level and don't face discrimination.
Segregation is not real. There's 20% of the population in Israel is Palestinian, full citizens, integrated in all levels of work and life there.
Well, here is what supposed liberal Zionist Benny Morris had to say about the well-integrated and totally cherished Israeli Arabs. The Israeli Arabs are a time bomb. Their slide into complete Palestinization has made them an emissary of the enemy that is among us. They are a potential fifth column in both demographic and security terms. They are liable to undermine the state. Undermine the state, bro. What is this, fucking Mussolini? So that if Israel again finds itself in a situation of existential threat as in 1948, it may be forced to act as it did then. By that, he means finish the ethnic cleansing, of course. Although Benny claims to be left-wing, he looks up to fascists like Jabotinsky, who advocated for an iron wall strategy of immense brutality when dealing with the Arab population. Benny even praised Sharon's apartheid wall and argued that something like a cage has to be built for the Palestinians. It's funny because in the US, the ones calling for building the wall are far-right, and figures like Destiny hate their political views. But he has no problem being all chummy-chummy with Morris, who holds nearly identical views to the most fringe portions of MAGA. Makes no sense. This guy fancies himself as an alternative to the crazy far-right types like Netanyahu and Smotrich. He's even considered by some to be a liberal, reasonable Zionist. Just goes to show you that there's not really such a thing. This silly mentality of liberal/left Zionism is part of what causes otherwise decent people to say shit like,
Israel had the right to defend itself,
while it's in the middle of committing a fucking genocide, as Bernie Sanders has done.
Do I believe that the state of Israel should be able to exist in peace and security? Yes. Does that make me a Zionist? I don't know what that word means. But do I believe that Israel has a right to exist? Of course it does.
Let's put this argument to bed real quick. People have the right to exist. A state has to justify its existence. South Africa should not have been able to exist in its apartheid form. It needed to dismantle that and exist in a different way. Fascist Italy didn't have the right to exist. The Third Reich didn't have the right to exist. Human beings have that right. Any state that regularly slaughters innocent people and subjects them to occupation does not have the imprescriptible right to exist. Not even the benign ones do. I mean, come on, Bernie. Even this fucking guy calls what Israel is doing in Gaza a genocide. Doesn't act like he believes it, but nonetheless, he'll use the term when you press him about it. So although I appreciate that Sanders advocates against things like sending more money to Netanyahu or corrupt Zionist lobbying organizations like AIPAC, he is still not the answer. He also has a close relationship with J Street, a different liberal Zionist lobbying group. According to J Street PAC's own website, Bernie is a frequent guest at their conventions and a consistent proponent of security aid to Israel. Keep in mind, Israel justifies all of the bad shit that it does in the name of security. So this is not good, Bernard. But that's enough about Senator Sanders. Let's move on. As I said, left Zionists tend to have no problem criticizing the occupation in the West Bank and other occupied territories, and sometimes they'll even admit that it's apartheid, yet when it comes time to criticize the blatantly discriminatory practices in Israel proper, they are nowhere to be found.
How beautiful, how multicultural, how free it feels for people, or just it's a beautiful place. It is. It's one of the most diverse places I've ever been.
It has become commonplace among many Zionist left scholars and activists to describe the forms of discrimination in the occupied territories as analogous to South Africa's apartheid system. In the occupied territories, different legal and administrative systems for the two populations, Jewish and non-Jewish, prevail. The parallels with South Africa are undeniable, yet members of the Zionist left in Israel refrain from acknowledging the apartheid nature within the Green Line. Professor Sari Makdisi rightly argues that almost every law of the South African apartheid has its equivalent in Israel today. Honig Parnas writes, if we take a look at Makdisi's article, A Racism Outside of Language, the one Honig Parnas was referring to, he draws a direct comparison between South Africa's Population Registration Act and Israeli nationality laws, arguing that Israel similarly assigns supremacist categorizations to national identity to maintain hierarchy, with rights and privileges contingent on belonging to the preferred group. According to Israeli law, there is no such thing as Israeli nationality. As the High Court put it in the 70s, there is no Israeli nation separate from the Jewish people, Makdisi writes. So the way this looks in practice is Jewish citizens of Israel are classified as having Jewish nationality, but non-Jews, though citizens, are excluded from the nation, which Israel defines as Jews worldwide. As a result, Palestinian citizens have their national identity denied and erased at every institutional level. Unlike Jewish citizens, Palestinians are stripped of national status and reduced to ethnicity, labeled Israeli Arabs, to erase their Palestinian identity. This term is not applied to Arab Jews who are absorbed into the Jewish identity, highlighting how Israel erases Arabness in Jews, but emphasizes it in Palestinians who cannot be absorbed as Jews. The idea that just because Palestinians in Israel proper hold Israeli citizenship, they are safe from discrimination is a myth propagated by the Israeli project. Palestinians in Israel proper are not protected and are allotted less dignity and rights solely due to their Palestinian heritage. In addition, brazenly discriminatory laws like Israel's 2018 nation-state law, which declares Israel the nation-state of the Jewish people exclusively, downgrades Arabic from an official language, and enshrines Jewish settlement as a national value, are shamelessly enacted and rarely acknowledged by liberal Zionists who prefer to pretend that Israel proper is swell and jolly, and that only those pesky occupied territories need fixing. Not to mention the complete disregard for the Palestinian right of return. A little context: the Palestinian refugees and their descendants who were ethnically cleansed from their homeland in 1948 are legally allowed to return to their homes and property, or, if they choose, get compensation for what they lost. This right is affirmed by UN General Assembly Resolution 194. Yet liberal Zionists often remain silent about this because an influx of Palestinians returning to their rightful homes would jeopardize their precious Jewish majority. Because obsessing over demographics like that is definitely something that fucking liberals and leftists should be caring about, and it's definitely normal for a so-called progressive to argue that removing the blockade on an ethnic minority would somehow be unsafe for the oppressors.
You're telling me if we were to lift the blockade and the wall around Gaza today, there wouldn't be more violence against Israelis?
Just imagine hearing that same argument in defense of apartheid South Africa, justifying the Bantustans because they kept white people safe. Liberal Zionists are unique in their ability to spew far-right rhetoric while still being able to benefit from a veneer of progressivism.
Ethan actually voted against Bibi when he lived there, so like...
As Honik Parnas put it, some left Zionists express their Orientalist tendencies openly in an attempt to defend the principle of the Jewish majority. This is done by means of transferring the political appearance of the majority discourse into the irrational arena of the supposed primordial collective characteristics of Islam and the Arabs. And we see this with the subjects of this video. To them, Palestinians can't be trusted to live alongside Jews because of some intrinsic barbarity or whatever stupid shit they believe.
And once the Palestinians outnumber the Jews, anything is fair game for the Jews.
Another tool used to weaken the ability for Palestinians to organize and resist the discrimination they face is separation. Separation projects have been organized to escalate the submission of separated Palestinians. In other words, they have strengthened the state's control of Palestinian access to resources and weakened the Palestinians' ability to resist oppression. Inside Israel, this policy has targeted Palestinian concentrated areas such as the Galilee and the Negev. Creating a Jewish majority in these regions has become a top priority of the Jewish state. The major aim of Judaization of these regions has been to prevent the emergence of a social, political, economic nucleus among the Palestinians. To achieve this, Jewish settlements were propped up in areas with large Palestinian populations. To maintain their exclusivity, these Jewish communities introduced regulations that effectively bar Palestinian citizens from joining. One key requirement is to declare commitment to Zionism and the Jewish state, which serves as a gatekeeping mechanism. This logic of separation within Israel proper is little more than a mirror of what is happening to Palestinians in the occupied territories. Liberal and left Zionists remain conveniently silent on this issue. When we think about Zionism today and we contrast it with leftism, it's easy to see how incompatible the two ideologies are. But it wasn't always seen that way. Back during the early days of the Zionist project, many self-described leftists were sympathetic to the idea because the early Zionist settlers claimed to be left-wingers who were building a socialist utopia in the desert. The Yishuv was the organized society of Jewish settlers in late 19th and early 20th century Palestine, prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. It was mainly represented politically by the Jewish Agency on the world stage, By the mid-1930s, David Ben-Gurion, then head of the Jewish Agency, had effectively taken the reins as the leader of the Yishuv. Ben-Gurion and his Zionist labor movement referred to themselves as socialists. They claimed to want to build a socialist utopia in the land of Palestine. This proclamation drew the support of many on the political left from all over the world. However, his movement was far from socialist or any genuine strain of leftist, really. The labor movement's version of socialism was a tool for implementing colonization rather than a means of creating a new social order. It demanded absolute subservience of all class interests and individual aspirations to the Zionist project. The Zionist labor movement did not raise any principled argument against private property, nor did it challenge the capitalist system. Its demand from the emerging bourgeoisie was for private capital to fulfill its role in developing the land and absorbing immigrants. Honig Parnas goes on to point out how this purported socialist project was exclusivist and economically devastating to the native Palestinian population who had been disenfranchised by the Zionist labor movement. Palestinians were prohibited from land and labor markets, and the goods they produced were banned. The Zionist labor movement's overarching trade union organization, the Histadrut, was a massive player in aiding the colonization of Palestine and the exclusion of the native Palestinians and their labor, pushing them into economic subjugation. Dating all the way back to the 1920s, the Zionist labor movement had been purchasing Palestinian land with the help of Zionist organizations around the world and evicting Palestinians who had lived there for generations. This, predictably, led to immense tension between the groups. As Ilan Pappé wrote, the signs of a disaster in the making were already evident as newly landless Palestinians, evicted from the farms they had made fruitful, were forced to move to the towns. These Palestinians were victims of nominally socialist Zionist groups known as Hebrew labor, who believed Jews could only modernize themselves through engagement in productive labor. Hence, they wanted agricultural work to become the preserve of Jews alone. He points this out to support the argument that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine was a long and deliberate process dating well before the events of 1948 and was headed by the quote-unquote Zionist left. Palestine was in no way a desert, nor were its peoples nomadic, nor were they primitive. While these illusions were propagated to make the Zionist project more palatable to Jews in Europe and beyond, Zionist thinkers knew full well that there was a native population that needed to be dealt with. Well before the 1920s, we can find Zionist leaders deliberating about how the Palestinian population could be moved. So let's put to bed the idea that Israel was simply formed as a response to the Holocaust. That played a role for sure, but the plans to ethnically cleanse Palestinians and build a nationalist supremacist state had been in motion for decades before. In fact, in post-war Israel, Holocaust victims were belittled and looked down upon for not sufficiently resisting their demise. David Ben-Gurion, who led the Zionist forces as they carried out the Nakba, later went on to become the first prime minister of Israel. He's seen by some as a left-wing hero, but he stood for nothing that leftists should stand for. He wasn't a socialist. We've already covered his approval of private capitalists as long as they served his nationalist aspirations. He was a colonizer, and he was extremely racist. As historian Avi Shleim wrote, Ben-Gurion declared that the Jews in Muslim countries had lived in a society that was backward, corrupt, uneducated, and lacking in independence and self-respect. The older immigrants from these countries, he opined, would never change fundamentally, but the younger ones had to be imbued with the superior moral and intellectual qualities of those who had created the state of Israel, meaning Ashkenazis. If heaven forbid we do not succeed, he warned, there is a danger that the coming generation may transform Israel into a Levantine state. Shleim, who himself is an Arab Jew originally from Iraq, was actually so put off by Ben-Gurion's racism and superiority complex toward Mizrahi Jews that, in his youth, he ended up supporting the far-right Arab hater Menachem Begin and his party, Heirut, which later merged and became the Likud party, the same party in power today. The only politician who impressed me during the election campaign was Menachem Begin, Shleim wrote. He says he didn't vote for Begin due to his right-wing policies or hawkish attitude toward Arabs, but because the Ashkenazi labor establishment looked down on Jews from the MENA region, allowing for Begin to tap into that shunned demographic. Shleim later goes on to say something that I think is imperative for all liberal/left Zionists to grapple with. The Zionist movement was in origin and in essence a European movement led by European Jews who wanted to create a Jewish state for European Jews. It aspired to be in the Middle East but not of the Middle East. It sought not the melding of cultures but the replacement of the local culture by a European one. It's beyond disappointing to see how many purported progressives have historically fallen for the Zionist ruse and continue to do so today. Even left-wing intellectual giants like Jean-Paul Sartre, who built his image on being anti-colonial and supportive of resistance by the oppressed, ended up making a fool of himself by hypocritically defending the Zionist project instead of rebuking it in its entirety. I mean, Sartre is the guy who rightfully criticized and eventually cut off his close friend Albert Camus for his reluctance to unequivocally condemn the French occupation of Algeria. Then he turns around and fails to fully condemn the Zionist colonial enterprise. It's rich to see Sartre fail to live up to his own writings when dealing with Israel. As the legendary and disappointed Edward Said wrote about Sartre after meeting him, Sartre struck me as worth the effort simply because I could not forget his position on Algeria, which, as a Frenchman, must have been harder to hold than a position critical of Israel. I was wrong, of course. With the exception of Algeria, the justice of the Arab cause simply could not make an impression on him. And whether it was entirely because of Israel or because of a basic lack of sympathy, cultural or perhaps religious, it's impossible for me to say. So whether it's modern-day left-wingers like Bernie Sanders or respected Marxist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, falling into the intellectual dissonance required to defend a project rooted in supremacy and genocide isn't out of the realm of possibility, but it should be. I'll end with one last Schleim quote that feels especially relevant here. For Palestinians, it makes little difference whether the Israeli government is left or right or center. Whatever the color of the government of the day, the Israeli regime is fundamentally built on the oppression of the Palestinians. It is a deeply entrenched apartheid regime. Left-wingers refuse to compromise with any other ethno-supremacist ideology. Zionism should be no different. To borrow the title of the incredible book which inspired this video, liberal and left Zionists are not the answer. They are false prophets of peace. Appreciate you all for watching and supporting the channel. Thanks to my patrons on Patreon, with a special thanks to those top-tier supporters. If you want the occasional extended, uncut video, early access to all my work, and other perks, consider becoming a patron. The books referenced in this video will be linked below along with the rest of the sources I used, and I recommend you give them a read if you want a deeper understanding on the topic. Thanks.